Hello, everyone. Welcome to week 10 of our course of an introduction to Korean history. And today we are looking at what we call the annexation of Korea by Japan. Actually, we're going to be looking at a little bit broader period of time than just the annexation, which took place in 1910, but we'll be looking at what's considered the early to mid period of the Japanese occupation of Korea. Although, if you've probably figured out by now, if you did the readings from weeks 8 and 9, it's probably pretty clear to you that calling 1910 the beginning of Japanese occupation is really not so accurate. Really, we can say practically since 1876, when Japan was able to militarily force Korea to open up to international trade, Korea has no longer been in control of itself. The process that was going on between 1876 and 1910 was Japan building up its own potential and its own power to be able to stand on a level with the Western powers, including Russia and even China. Prior to that, Japan had been kind of the junior partner in the region, but they were a quick study. They developed and modernized very quickly, especially militarily, technologically, and they were able to build up their shipbuilding, weapon building, army training, and everything up to the contemporary level of European technology within a matter of decades. And so Korea's experience was coming out of complete isolation. That period we call the Hermit Kingdom, right? Where Korea did not allow any outside influence. Then suddenly they're forced open and they're practically in the Middle Ages in terms of technology. And then they have to try to catch up as quickly as possible while Japan is busy catching up to the Western world. So really, Korea never was able to catch up to be anything like a match for Japan during that period. And of course, as we've mentioned, Korea's declaration of itself as an empire was basically just empty words in the air because there was nothing to rule over and nothing to do it with. So even though Korea was officially an empire, Japan was officially an empire, I think Japan encouraged Korea to become an empire just for international, appearances prior to overtaking or taking over that country. But definitely from 1910, we have a qualitatively different experience because in the past, Japan had been meddling in Korean politics. They had assassinated the queen. They had changed all kind of ministers and gradually infiltrated with business people and settlers into Korea. But now, officially, militarily, Japan has taken over Korea completely. And so Korea is now annexed as part of the Japanese Empire officially in 1910. We need to back up a little bit and talk about a couple of important events that you'll see in your timeline. 1895 was an important time. That's when the first Independence Club of Korea was formed. And interestingly enough, it was brought into existence by Korean intelligentsia who had been invited to study in Japan. And so they were inherently quite pro-Japanese. But in 1895, the Independence Club of Korea was focused on Korea modernizing along the Japanese model. So they were very pro-Japanese at first. And then as Japan increasingly took over Korea, the Independence Club became something else. It became a voice of criticism and critique of what Japan was doing in Korea. But that was a process over decades. In 1905, as you remember, Japan defeated Russia in the Russo-Japanese War, and that was the final nail in the coffin for Korea. That Russia was the last sort of international competitor with Japan militarily, but they were soundly and decisively defeated by the Japanese. And so the Japanese by 1910 were the only game in town, so to speak, in East Asia. No one could stand up to them. In 1907, Emperor Kojong, considered the last emperor of Japan, of Korea, sorry. His son was actually put on the throne after he was forced to abdicate by the Japanese in 1907. But that was not considered a real king as far as the Koreans were concerned. King Kojong is often considered the last real king, and he attempted in 1907 to send a delegation to The Hague to speak against Japanese aggression. The delegation was not received by the international community. And so Korea stood alone against Japan and was simply absorbed by the more powerful country. Immediately after Japan took over Korea, they began, quote unquote, modernizing it. And there was a campaign of showing internationally that they were benevolent rulers, that their rule of Korea was beneficial to the Koreans by modernization. And they made a big show of constructing dams and train systems and modern shipyards and docking facilities. But secretly, interestingly enough, those were of much more benefit to Japan than Korea, because they facilitated the swift movement of military resources and troops through Korean Peninsula toward Manchuria and parts of China, which would be quite soon very helpful for their imperial designs. There were debates going on in Japan. If you're a student of Japan, you know that there were debates. There were people who were more on a democratic side, saying that we'd like to invite Korea to be part of a Japanese sort of co-prosperity sphere where each country maintains its independence, but they're part of a kind of a United Nations of East Asia, and we can all work together and be a happy family. Unfortunately, those voices were overruled. And unfortunately, those individuals were often the targets of execution, especially in Korea and Manchuria. And so an unfortunate side effect of some of the early guerrilla movements within Korea were the assassination of some of the pro-democratic Japanese rulers. And so increasingly, the far right spectrum of Japanese politics took control. Militarism and totalitarianism took greater and greater control in the first few decades of the 20th century, much to the detriment of Korea. In the beginning, there was a kind of a back and forth, a sort of seesaw effect. There were times when Japan was trying to modernize Korea, outbreaks and unrest would erupt in Korea, and then the Japanese would respond with excessive force, killing thousands and thousands of civilians as well as combatants in these rebellions. And then Japan would say, okay, now we're going to be the good guys again. And they would start to try to, modernize the healthcare and the education systems and all these kind of things. So there were kind of waves up and down as you read through the material between a kind of benevolent rule on the part of Japan in Korea, and other times very harsh repression and almost animalistic repression and loss of life and property within Korea. In 1919, this was a very important year for Korea because in both good and bad ways. In 1919, a movement in Korea began called the March 1st movement, and it's still remembered as the first and greatest organized movement in Korea for Korean independence from Japan. So that's not even a decade into Japan's occupation of Korea. But unfortunately, it was suppressed by a very bloody way by the Japanese military. During that same year, several governments in exile of Korea, so Korean government in exile, it seemed to be a very popular title. There were lots of them in different cities, almost every city in East Asia and in Russia and in the United States. We're the government of Korea in exile. No, we're the government of Korea in exile. But a man named Syngman Rhee, um, from among these movements, said, guys, we got to get our act together. And he united all the factions into one Korean government in exile. And of course, Syngman Rhee, as we'll later hear, goes on to be the first president of independent Korea after Japanese occupation comes to an end. The last emperor, officially last emperor of Korea, remember Korea had become an empire, so not only Chosun dynasty, but the last emperor of Korea, Sunjong, who was the son of what many Koreans consider to be the last king of Korea. He died in 1926, and that sparked new efforts for independence in Korea from Japan. In 1929, a scuffle between high school students sparked a nationwide rebellion, once again, a fresh rebellion against Japan. It was very organized and coordinated. It started out in Gwangju, but then spread throughout the school system of all of Korea. So it was mostly the students, the high school students primarily, and handfuls of university students. There were very few at the university level. But they really led this movement, again, calling for Korean independence from Japan. Unfortunately, was not successful. And the final nail in the coffin for any thoughts of independence occurred in 1931 with what's called the Mukden or Manchurian incident. It was a bombing, but it was not a legitimate bombing. It was supposedly some Manchurian freedom fighters that had bombed some Japanese facility. But in fact, historians have discovered later that they were actually Japanese sort of undercover agents that exploded a bomb and then blamed the Manchurians as an excuse for taking over Manchuria. And interestingly enough, the Japanese government had no knowledge of this plan. It was totally the local Japanese forces said, we could take this place over. Here's how we can do it. And they just did it without consulting anybody. And it was a done deal. Japan took over Manchuria, and now Korea is a component in a growing Japanese empire, now spreading throughout Eastern China. And so the decision is made around this time that Korea must be completely integrated into the Japanese empire, and that means re-education. And so when we come into our next week, we'll be talking about the lead up to World War II and how Japan changed the entire education system, outlawed Korean language, and forced kindergartners on up to learn Japanese and see themselves as citizens of Japan, as part of the Japanese empire. And so the Japanization, as we have said, and some have said, of Korea. That's what we'll be talking about next time. We have the readings, a timeline, and the quiz for this week. And I just hope everything goes well in your studies. Don't